She was dragged into the desert and tied to a tree to die, all because her master discovered she was pregnant. Under the scorching sun, with no water and no mercy, the young slave no longer had the strength to scream. But no one imagined that, on that forgotten road, a foreign duke, ridiculed by all as crippled and useless, would pass by at that very moment. What he did next not only defied the law of the landowners, but forever changed her destiny and scandalized the entire country. And before continuing this striking story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because I know you won't want to miss the outcome of this forbidden tale. Sarah Johnson was born in 1836, on the same arid piece of land where now her life seemed condemned to end. She was the daughter of Mary, a seamstress slave whose hands were so skillful that even the white ladies of the region asked her to mend their dresses. Of her father, little was known. A black man brought from Georgia, sold too young and killed too soon in a punishment no one dared to speak of aloud. The blood running through Sarah's veins, therefore, carried the memory of generations of pain, but also of resistance. From a young age, Sarah was not like the other children in the quarters, not because she was better, but because she was observant. Where the boys played and the girls merely obeyed, she paid attention to how plants grew, to the effect of herbs on the body, to the exact point where a thread would break in the loom or in a dress. She learned to sew from her mother at just 7, handling the needle with such dexterity that she soon became the girl called upon to mend the clothes of the other children. By 9, she already knew how to heal minor cuts, clean wounds, and prepare poultices with leaves she learned to identify with Aunt Grace, the community midwife. This gift of healing made her precious among her own. But in the big house, her talent was seen only as convenience, something that cut costs and spared the Miller family from spending on doctors. No one there would admit it, but they knew that without Sarah, many would have fallen ill without remedy. Master Jonathan Miller, however, always looked at her as one observes a useful animal, never as a person, and that for Sarah was the rule of the world she was born into. She could save lives, but she had no right to her own. What almost no one realized was how much Sarah also longed for inner freedom. She silently carried a collection of stories she had heard from the elders about places where a woman could walk without lowering her head. She repeated these memories like prayers before sleep. When she began to grow into a woman, her simple beauty drew attention. Her steady eyes, her skin luminous despite the sun, her discreet posture, everything about her attracted looks that could mean protection or danger. And it was precisely in the silence of the big house that this danger materialized. William Miller, the master's son, had learned from an early age that nothing was denied him. Raised among parties, trips, and hunts, he believed he could take whatever he wanted. He began showing up in the kitchen whenever Sarah was sewing there, a compliment, then a disguised touch, until the inevitable happened on a stifling night when she tried to resist and no one heard her. Sarah told no one. First, because who would believe her word against the master's son? Second, because she knew the truth would not protect her. It would only bring harsher punishments. So she chose to carry her silence as one carries hidden stones in the chest. She kept working, helping in births, smiling when she had to. But inside, she knew something had changed forever. Imagine if it were you in her place. Would you have kept that secret or exposed the truth? It all began on a stifling morning in July 1854, when the routine of the big house carried on as always. The slaves went back and forth in hurried steps, balancing trays, cleaning corridors, lowering their eyes whenever one of the Millers passed. Among them was Sarah Johnson, only 20 years old, tasked with serving coffee in the main hall. Sweat ran down her face, but it was not only from the heat. There were days when her body no longer responded as before. The nausea came in the mornings, the fatigue knocked her down without warning, and the dizziness seemed to worsen each week. That day, before the gathered masters, Sarah staggered. The tray trembled in her hands, the glasses clinked, and before anyone understood, she collapsed to the floor, fainting. The noise echoed through the hall like a whip crack. The white ladies covered their mouths. Master Miller furrowed his brow. William, seated in a corner, rose too quickly as if to help, but stepped back when he noticed his father's sharp eyes. 2 servants dragged her out under curt orders. Hours later, while Sarah was still trying to recover in the quarters, a conversation slipped through the corridors. 2 older servants whispered, "She's pregnant, the midwife already noticed." The rumor spread like wildfire, reaching Jonathan Miller's ears in less than an hour. The patriarch stopped what he was doing, his face reddening with rage. Pregnant, one of his slaves, inside his house. It was more than a scandal. It was an affront. That afternoon, another revelation deepened his fury. One of the overseers, eager to show loyalty, muttered that he had seen his son, William Miller, prowling around the quarters some nights before. Jonathan clenched his jaw. The possibility that the child growing in Sarah's womb was his own grandson made him tremble with indignation. For a man like him, the disgrace was not in abusing slaves. That was accepted practice normalized by the cruelty of the system. The true disgrace was admitting that one of them could carry his family's blood. Consumed by rage, Jonathan decided that this could not go unpunished. He would not allow the Miller name to be tied to that child. The plan arose cold, calculated. Turn Sarah into the villain. She would not be seen as the victim. She would be accused of seduction, of having lured the white son of the house into sin. Jonathan knew everyone would accept that version. After all, who would believe the word of a slave against that of a white young man of standing? By dusk, he gathered the slaves in the front yard. The sun burned, but the silence was even more suffocating. Sarah was pushed to the center, her face pale, her body frail. Jonathan raised his voice, every word loaded with hatred and scorn. She thought she could hide disgrace in my house, then she will die as a warning. Murmurs spread. Some slaves lowered their eyes, others fought not to cry. William in the corner tried to look indifferent, but his hands trembled. His father did not look at him directly. He didn't need to. It was enough to shout against Sarah, to turn her pregnancy into a crime, to erase any suspicion of the true culprit. Jonathan's hatred was not only moral, it was fear. Fear that the truth would come out. Fear that his family's name would be stained. He preferred to kill a young pregnant woman than admit the weakness of his own son. For the enslaved community, this was nothing new. They had seen innocents punished to save the reputation of whites. But there was something different that day. Perhaps it was Sarah's gaze, which even in weakness carried a strange dignity, almost defiant. Perhaps it was William's silence, heavier than any shout. Jonathan ended his speech spitting on the ground. He ordered her to be taken into the desert, tied to a tree until the sun and the animals finished the work. Thus they will learn, he said, that no one stains the name of this house with impunity. At that moment, Sarah ceased to be just a pregnant slave. She became the target of a cruel plan, a scapegoat created to cover up the true sin of the big house. But none of those present knew that destiny was preparing something even more improbable. An encounter capable of turning this story upside down. When Sarah heard her master's sentence, her whole body shook. The blood seemed to drain from her veins, leaving her pale, almost breathless. She stood still for a few seconds, hardly comprehending. Then came the whirlwind of questions. Cry? Beg? Try to run? But run where? When the guards already surrounded every exit of the big house. The shadows of the overseers were like iron. Walls and their hard stares made it clear there was no possible escape. With each step the men took toward her, Sarah's legs trembled more. Her heart pounded so loudly it seemed it might burst from her chest. Even so, in a last desperate gesture, she turned to William, the true culprit, the man who had so often prowled her bed and now pretended never to have touched her. Her eyes searched for pity, perhaps remorse, but he averted his face, cold as stone, as if Sarah were a stranger, a nuisance, to be erased. That indifference hurt more than the announced punishment. The guards seized her violently, ignoring her pleas. Please, no, I beg you. I have a child. The words were lost in the dry night air, muffled by the creak of chains binding her wrists and ankles. Like an animal, Sarah was shoved into the wooden cart, her ankles chained to the floor so she could not leap. The rough wood tore at her already fragile skin. The journey began in silence, broken only by the sound of wheels, striking potholes and the whip snapping from time to time to spur the horses. Sarah curled up, clutching her belly as if she could protect the child inside her. Each jolt of the cart made her sob. Tears streamed uncontrollably, mixing with sweat and dust clinging to her face. The thought that tore her apart was simple and cruel. This could be her last night alive. She would die without ever seeing her child's face, without ever holding it in her arms. The sky was moonless, and only the stars silently watched that procession of despair. The overseers exchanged no words. They followed only the master's orders. Sarah, leaning against the cart wall, tasted blood in her mouth from biting her lips. in an attempt to stifle her cries. Inside her, a thread of hope fought against the certainty of death. Perhaps someone, perhaps God, would look upon her, but the desert offered nothing but silence and sand. The road cutting through the region was the route of travelers heading to California, where gold and the promise of wealth attracted foreigners. Among them was Edward Harrington, 31, known as the Lame Duke, a British noble who, though limping since the Crimean War, kept an erect posture and a calm, calculating gaze. Ridiculed in salons for his disability, yet respected in business, Edward crossed the desert in search of lands to invest in. His retinue was small, composed of 2 trusted men and some servants. He rode a black horse, while his cane rested strapped to the side of the saddle. The journey had been peaceful until then. They conversed about cotton prices, the possibility of new plantations, and the rumor that Texas would become a strategic point for foreigners. Edward seemed distant, gazing at the horizon as if seeking something beyond business, perhaps meaning, perhaps a new beginning. He had no idea that that very night his fate would intertwine with that of a young pregnant slave. The cart carrying Sarah advanced along the secondary road, while the Duke's retinue approached on the main trail. The clash of worlds, the brutality of a sentence without defense, and the unexpected presence of a foreigner with power was about to occur. The wind began to blow stronger, raising dust in the air. The cartwheels creaked and Sarah silently prayed, "Lord, if mercy still exists, show me now." Now imagine being chained, pregnant, and taken to die. If you believe Sarah doesn't deserve this, write now in the comments, "Justice." I want to see how many of you have the courage to give her a voice. The overseers reached a remote spot, a corner of the desert where the sand seemed to swallow the horizon and only a dry tree resisted time. It was the place chosen so no one would hear the screams, so the night would be the sole witness. Without speaking, the men climbed down from the cart, seized Sarah by the arms, and dragged her like a burden. She sobbed, her legs buckling, but no trace of humanity appeared in the hardened faces that pulled her along. Brutally, they threw her against the tree trunk. The coarse ropes dug into her wrists and ankles so tightly that her skin split in scratches. The knots were firm, calculated to give no chance of escape. The sound of the rope tightening echoed in the desert silence, each loop around the trunk resounding like a sentence. Sarah pleaded with a trembling voice, "Please, I beg you, don't take from me the chance to see my child." Her pleas resounded in the void, but not in the men's hearts. The oldest overseer only pulled the rope tighter, tying her with such coldness that anyone even from afar would feel the weight of that cruelty. In the background, Master Jonathan Miller watched, arms crossed, like someone overseeing a spectacle he himself had ordered. His eyes were stone, incapable of wavering. To him it was not a young woman begging for mercy. It was merely a public lesson against disgrace. Sarah wept, her whole body trembling, her heart racing. With each tug of the rope, she felt hope slip away, as if it were possible to hear the cracking of her own dreams breaking. Night was already falling. The sky began to stain dark red, and the shadow of the tree cast her tied figure as if she were already a corpse awaiting her fate. And it was exactly at that instant, when the darkness seemed to seal her fate, that an unexpected presence approached along another dirt road. Edward Harrington, the British Duke known as the Lame, travelled with his small retinue. It was nearly 8 o'clock when one of his servants, uneasy, suggested, "My lord, perhaps we should stop to rest. Night falls quickly in this desert." Edward, sitting upright despite his fatigue, stared at the road ahead. His blue eyes reflected the torchlight illuminating the path. There was unease in his posture, as if sensing that it was not yet time to rest. "No, let's go a little further," he replied, his voice calm but firm. The decision seemed trivial, but 15 minutes later, destiny revealed itself. As they advanced around a bend in the road, Edward saw something that took his breath away. Against the dusk, the scene formed like a nightmare. A black woman, with a look of terror, tied to a tree in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by men with stony expressions. The wind blew her dirty dress, and the rising moonlight illuminated the despair in her eyes. Edward's eyes widened in shock. It was not just brutality, it was the public staging of a slow murder. The shock was so intense that for a second, silence dominated his carriage. Then with a firm voice he ordered, "Stop the carriage!" The coachman, alarmed, pulled the reins. The horses neighed. The servant beside him tried to intervene. "Don't get involved, my lord. Here, Laws are different. Edward stood still for a moment, staring at the scene from afar, and then replied with the coldness of someone who already carried the scars of war. Then let them be broken. Before anyone could argue, he was already descending from the carriage with unexpected swiftness. His cane struck the ground hard at every step, but what his enemies called weakness was at that moment a symbol of decision. Lame? Yes. Hesitant? Never. His erect silhouette stood out against the glow of the moonlight, and his presence, even before any action, seemed to announce that something extraordinary was about to happen. With every step toward that scene, Edward Harrington was not just approaching a condemned slave, he was approaching the impossible, what no one had ever dared to do in those lands. If you also believe Sarah deserves to live, prove it now by leaving your like. The hot desert wind swirled dust in circles as Edward Harrington stepped down from the carriage, leaning on his cane. His figure seemed out of place in that setting. Elegant clothes, firm gaze, and an air of authority that contrasted with the brutality around him. Before him, the overseer, a large, sweaty man, with hands stained with dirt and blood, stood in a defiant posture. His firm hand gripped the whip handle, as if ready to prove at any moment who owned that piece of land. Sarah was tied to the tree, her body exhausted, her face wet with tears and dust. When she realized that the foreign man was willing to confront them, her heart raced even more, but instead of hope, fear consumed her. What if it all ended worse? What if his boldness only hastened her death? Edward took a deep breath. His voice rang firm, without raising the tone. How much is this young woman's life worth? I'll pay in gold. The overseer laughed, a bitter and cruel laugh before spitting on the ground. She's going to die. Master's orders. And he pointed behind him, where Jonathan Miller watched from afar, mounted on his horse. The master stared at the scene with a cold gaze like someone watching a spectacle. Edward did not back down. Even limping, he took 2 steps forward, opened his coat, and pulled out a document. The red seal gleamed in the moonlight. This is a letter from the British consulate. If this execution goes forward, tomorrow I'll be in the New Orleans newspapers. You won't be facing only my word, but that of the English crown. The tension grew. The air seemed heavy. Sarah looked at the 2 men, her heart caught in her throat. The overseer narrowed his eyes and replied with disdain, "That's just paper, Englishman. Paper doesn't scare anyone around here." Edward gripped his cane tightly, his voice sharper. "Then, tell me, man, what is this girl's crime? What justifies such brutality?" Silence. Neither the overseer nor the guards nor Jonathan himself dared to answer. Everyone knew the truth. The only crime was an unwanted pregnancy. The Duke then drew a deep breath and, without hesitation, pulled out another heavy leather pouch from the carriage. The sound of coins echoed in the night air. "I double the offer. I'll take her with me now." The overseer glanced sideways at the master, uncertain. Jonathan, however, kept his hard expression, until finally he broke the silence with venom in his voice. "Only a cripple would pay so much for trash like that." The words cut through the air like blades. Sarah closed her eyes, and a sob escaped involuntarily. The ropes bit into her skin, but what hurt more was hearing her very existence reduced to that. Jonathan lifted his chin and added, spitting his contempt, "You can have her. Do what you want. But remember, you're buying a whore. She's pregnant and God knows by whom." Sarah could not hold back her tears. Her whole body shook with sobs. The tears soaked her torn dress, and the shame burned hotter than the desert sun. She wanted to disappear, for the earth to swallow her, because being reduced to those words in front of strangers was a wound no scar could ever erase. Edward closed his eyes for a moment. There was no anger in his expression, but a silent pain, as if he had felt the weight of that humiliation along with her. Approached slowly, pulled the dagger from his waist, and with a firm stroke cut the ropes that bound her to the trunk. The sound of the rope snapping echoed like the crack of freedom. Sarah collapsed to her knees in the sand, clutching her belly. She breathed with difficulty, as if each breath had to be pulled from the depths of her soul. The Duke knelt before her, even with difficulty because of his leg, and extended his hand to her. Jonathan Miller pulled the reins of his horse and turned his back without looking back. His men followed him in silence, defeated, but still spitting hatred in their eyes. The dust lifted by the horses vanished into the darkness, and the desert returned to silence. The Duke's servants did not dare question anything. They were astonished by their master's boldness. They knew that defying a patriarch like Jonathan Miller on his own land was nearly suicidal, but Edward Harrington, limping firmly across the desert sand, showed no regret. His blue eyes carried the calm of someone who had already faced wars greater than this. "Give her water," he ordered in a low tone that allowed no argument. One of the servants hurried, pulling out a leather flask and offering it to the young woman. Sarah, still trembling, received the container with hesitant hands. She drank a few gulps and let the water run down her cracked lips. Her eyes, still lowered, filled with tears. She took a deep breath and, in an almost whisper, thanked. "I owe you my life, sir." Edward observed her for a moment with an indecipherable expression. There was no triumph in his face, only a silent gravity. He lightly lifted his cane and said, "Get in. We'll continue our journey." Sarah obeyed, with slow steps. She leaned on a servant's arm and climbed into the carriage. Her heart still beat fast, but inside her something strange, almost impossible, began to bloom: hope. Meanwhile, Jonathan Miller returned to the big house consumed by fury. Upon arriving, William awaited, him in the room restless. The tension was so thick it seemed the walls absorbed the father's hatred. "What happened?" the son asked, anxious. Jonathan, still with dust on his face, answered through clenched teeth, "The damn Duke, that crippled Englishman. He bought your slave, threw gold in my face and took her as if she were a prize." William paled. The blood rushed to his face, his hands clenched into fists. As much as he would not admit it, as much as he had discarded Sarah, as if she were nothing. The idea of another man, and worse, a foreigner, touching her, was unbearable. It was not love, it was possession, a desire poisoned by pride. No one else could touch her but me," he muttered through his teeth. That night, William did not sleep. Hatred burned like fire in his mind. The next morning, the city streets were buzzing. The rumor had spread. A British duke, lame and powerful, had arrived in the region. Merchants commented. Women whispered from balconies, and even slaves heard of a foreigner who dared buy a young woman just to defy a local master. Curious and filled with rage, William decided to go there. He mounted his horse and rode to the inn where they said the Duke was staying. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the venom of humiliation. Upon arrival, what he saw left him stunned. At the entrance, Edward Harrington was speaking with merchants. He wore a light linen suit, cane in his right hand, posture erect despite his injured leg. But it was not the Duke who caught William's gaze. It was the figure beside him, Sarah. She was there, no longer in the torn dress of the quarters, but in clean, modest, well-fitted clothes. Her hair, once disheveled by despair, was now neatly tied. Her skin seemed to glow under the morning sun, and though her head remained bowed, there was a new dignity in her, almost impossible to deny. At the Duke's side, she was no longer just a slave. She was his companion. William's chest burned. The memories of that night when he had abused her returned like knives. He had discarded Sarah, reduced her to nothing, and now she was there, radiant, before the whole city, under the protection of a foreigner who not only freed her, but presented her in public as someone worthy of being seen. Whispers filled the streets. Men and women murmured with scandal, voices heavy with disdain and curiosity. A white duke with a black woman. It's absurd. Where has such dishonor ever been seen? The murmurs spread like wildfire. For the masters it was an affront. For some slaves who watched from afar it was a breath of hope. If a white man could defy the rules of that world, maybe a different future was possible. Sarah, without lifting her eyes, sensed his presence. Her whole body trembled. It was not fear as before, but the awareness that he no longer had any power over her. She was at the Duke's side, protected by a scandal that had become impossible to erase. The whole city was pointing fingers at Sarah. But here in the comments, her voice needs to be stronger. Right now, strengthen Sarah and show she is not alone. William's heart burned like a blazing ember. Every glance from the crowd, every whisper, every muffled laugh seemed to mock him, reminding him that the possession he once thought his alone now walked at another man's side. He could not bear to see Sarah, whom he had used, discarded, and condemned, appear there, clean, well-dressed, with a dignity that defied the silence of the city. The venom of humiliation coursed through his veins. Then, before everyone, he could not contain his rage. His voice rang out loud, laden with scorn. "What nonsense! Are you so desperate that you chose a slave? A whore? And pregnant at that? Aren't you ashamed?" William's mocking laughter echoed like a whip. The sarcastic laugh sought to strip the Duke of his honor before merchants, landowners, and even the curious who crowded to watch. The whispers grew. The crowd held its breath. Sarah, pierced by the words like daggers, trembled. Blood rushed to her face. With teary eyes she lowered her head, ashamed. With a trembling voice she murmured toward the Duke, "My lord, if you wish I can leave. I don't want to cause you trouble." Edward looked at her in silence for a moment. The tension was so heavy it seemed even the wind had stopped. Then, with a firm gesture, he took Sarah's hand before everyone. His blue gaze met not only the young woman's, but also the accusing eyes of the crowd. His voice rang deep with authority that silenced the whispers. "Ashamed?" He raised Sarah's hand before everyone. "How could I be ashamed to have an incredible woman like her by my side? Shame belongs to those who must force someone to have them, and then order her death to hide their crimes." The impact was immediate. The square, once filled with murmurs, fell silent. The weight of the accusation was not only against William, but against all who thought they owned bodies and destinies. Sarah, in shock, did not know whether to cry or smile. Her heart pulsed in a storm of emotions: fear, surprise, but also something new, the sensation of being seen, defended, recognized. William, red with rage, could not bear it. With clenched fists, he lunged at the Duke, shouting, "This is an outrage! You dare humiliate me before everyone?" Edward did not step back. His lame body stood firm on the ground with the cane. His voice, calm but sharp as a blade, stopped him. "If you dare lay even a finger on me, you'll be finished." The crowd gasped. Some exchanged anxious looks, waiting for what would unfold. The silence broke when Jonathan Miller, the patriarch, appeared in the middle of the crowd. His presence hushed the murmurs. With a stern face, he gripped his son's arm before the blow could land. "Enough, William," he ordered coldly. The young man struggled, but his father's firm hand pulled him back. His fury mingled with shame, and his tear-filled eyes revealed the impotent hatred consuming him. Edward, still holding Sarah's hand in his, took advantage of the silence that fell. He looked at the gathered crowd, white men in suits, women fanning themselves, slaves on the margins watching from afar, all paralyzed by a scene they never imagined seeing. His voice rose again, this time softer, but filled with emotion. "You call this dishonor, but I say it is courage. I don't just respect her, I want her by my side forever." Then, before everyone, Edward turned to Sarah. His gaze pierced her like a promise. The young woman, still trembling, found courage in the steady brightness of those eyes. Without waiting for anyone's permission, the Duke leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was intense, passionate, but above all public. There was no way to pretend, no way to deny. The shock rippled through the crowd like fire in dry straw. Ladies gasped, men narrowed their eyes in anger, some laughed nervously, but all, without exception, were marked by the scandal. Jonathan Miller felt the world spin. William, defeated, recoiled as if he had been slapped before the entire town. And Sarah, still in disbelief, allowed herself to close her eyes and live that moment. A kiss that transformed her condition from condemned slave into something unimaginable. A woman loved, recognized, defended before all. In that kiss, there was not only affection, there was defiance, rupture, and the promise of a different future. A future no one there would dare predict. If this scene gave you chills and you want to follow every detail of this forbidden story, subscribe now to the channel and activate the bell so you won't miss anything. Sarah still felt she was living a dream from which she could wake at any moment. Her heart pounded with every beat. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. She could hardly believe that after so much suffering, she was there, in the Duke's chambers, not as a servant, not as a prisoner, but as someone who had been given a choice. When Edward gently called her, his voice echoed firm yet full of humanity. He looked at her seriously, his blue eyes reflecting the soft glow of the candles. "Sarah, if you don't accept, I will set you free. You'll be free to go wherever you wish, but if your heart allows, I want you as my wife. I don't care what happened in the past. No one will ever have the right to humiliate you again." The words, simple and direct, crossed Sarah's soul like balm. No one had ever given her an option. No one had ever asked what she wanted. For the first time in her life, the decision was in her hands. The weight of the choice made her cry. Hot tears rolled down her face. She couldn't form words, only nodded, affirming through sobs. Edward approached and wrapped her in a firm, protective embrace. She felt the warmth of his chest, the serene rhythm of his breath, And there, in the arms of the man who had dared to face everyone for her, she found comfort. He only murmured, "Now you are safe." The next morning the two departed. The city, still buzzing with scandal, watched them from afar, but no one dared approach. The carriage followed the dirt road, carrying not only two travelers, but a story that broke chains and defied conventions. Edward Harrington invested his name and fortune in a distant land. He bought vast fields, built a solid manor house, struck deals with local merchants, and little by little transformed that place into a refuge. But the true foundation of everything was Sarah, who gradually blossomed from within. Months later, the baby was born, a boy with deep eyes, carrying in his strong cry the promise of a new generation. Edward held him in his arms and said softly, only for Sarah to hear, "He is the beginning of everything." Days turned into years. Two more boys came, each bringing with them laughter, running, and life to that house that was once only stone and wood. The family grew surrounded by love and respect. Sarah, who had once lived chained to a tree, now walked freely through the fields, guiding her children's steps. In the afternoons, when the sun gilded the horizon and the wind blew softly across the verandas, she sat beside her husband, her hands, marked by life, intertwined with his. Edward, even limping, always made a point of holding his head high, as if telling the world that nothing, neither scars nor prejudice, could strip away the dignity they had conquered together. In those moments, Sarah looked into his eyes, her heart overflowing with gratitude. She didn't need grand speeches, only the simple truth escaped her lips with sincerity. "I love you. Thank you for giving me a life I never dreamed of having." Edward smiled, and in silence he returned her words because he knew that their love was living proof that the impossible could happen. On that beautiful veranda, hand in hand, Sarah no longer saw chains, nor trunks, nor desert. She saw only the family they built, the home they raised, and the certainty that despite everything she had won. The story of Sarah shows us that no one is defined by the past, nor by the chains imposed upon them. True love is the one that chooses, protects, and sets free, even when the whole world points against it. And if you thought this story was moving, wait until you hear about a slave who was sold to her own brother, and the secret he hid changed her life forever. Click on the video now appearing on your screen and get ready for another revelation that will give you chills.